Chapter 3. Saint Carella was a brigantine captured by Ingratia's crew about 5 miles out from Portia in western Tydale. It belonged to an Aeostean lumber company and was used to haul goods to manufacture warships in Stateria. The original plan was to seize the lumber to repair their old sloop, scuttle the ship, and make off with the captives for ransom. However, it turns out that disgruntled sailors 2 months behind on wages respond rather well to the prospect of piracy. A number of prisoners expressed interest in joining Ingratia's ranks, and, taking them up on their offer, the captain decided she needed a bigger vessel. Half of the crew were brought into her employ on condition that they turn over any hidden wealth stowed away by their old captain. They did so happily. The rest were transplanted onto the old sloop and sent away as a show of good faith, all but the captain, who was strung up by his thumbs and lashed publicly. The spectacle made for a good show of strength and a cathartic bit of revenge for the newly inducted. Ingratia had a strict policy, however. Her ship would at all times be at least 60% women. The inductees nearly broke her demanded ratio, so she proclaimed the terms of their employment at once. It was declared to her crew that chauvinism must be checked on the shores. Staterians, Sapertians, Aeostians, Chalene, men, women. They would grow rich together or sink to the ocean floor as one grand feast for the bottom feeders. Rape was punishable by keel hauling. If the troops needed release, they'd visit brothels when they went ashore. No such behavior would be tolerated on her ship. Disagreements were to be settled on land, preferably with blunt weapons to prevent their numbers from dwindling every time a petty vendetta broke out. The rules applied to captives as well, as most women brought aboard were more than eager to join their crew to escape the mundanity and indignity of servitude. Any trepidations regarding Ingratia's standards were lost when the pirates saw firsthand what sort of wealth their cooperation yielded. Saint Carella terrorized the Casair Sea, its crew of just 80 sailors making hell for nobles and aristocrats seeking their fortunes in foreign trade. Boarding with the letter of marque tucked safely in her breast pocket, Ingratia ordered the sailors on deck to make their final preparations and assemble the rest of the crew before morning of the next day. Many of them grumbled in protest. For the Aeostean natives, it was the first time they'd been in Dublin in months. The circumstances of their profession made docking in such a populous city a rarity, and many wished to visit friends and family. The non-Aeostians wanted to enjoy the city's extravagance for themselves, check out the brothels and taste the local drink. She felt a twinge of guilt, having herself indulged the city even while the letter burned in her pocket. The guilt was overpowered by the creeping sense that her privateer privilege would be revoked if she didn't set sail soon. When she entered the captain's quarters, Melina was still in bed, laying with her head atop several pillows and her legs bent upwards towards her body. A large hardcover book rested on her thighs. She jolted immediately when she heard the cabin door open. "Have you got it?" she asked, tossing the book aside and fixing her large brown eyes on Ingratia. She was a Chalene girl, brought into the crew when Ingratia was just beginning her career of plunder. After a skirmish with an opposing pirate vessel over looting rights to a hefty haul of Chalene silks, Ingratia had her first major victory in a full-on naval battle. When their captain caught a pilum in his throat, the opposing pirates hoisted the white flag. They forfeited their spoils, a captive Melina among them. As a former university student studying of all things linguistics, she proved immediately useful as a translator. Within weeks, they were smitten with each other. Fortunately, Melina proved just as valuable a translator as she did an advisor and lover. The captain wasted little time making her second in command. "Have I got what?" Ingratia feigned ignorance, turning her back to hide the letter. "Oh, don't tease me! Let me see it!" The spry woman leapt from bed and jumped at her, attempting to grab the letter from her pocket. She was half-dressed, and her exposed skin, while dark, looked pale in contrast to the parts of her that regularly graced the sun on deck during the hot summer. Ingratia scooped the girl into her arms and tossed her back into bed. A playful yelp left Melina's mouth. The pirate plopped down next to her and withdrew the letter to read aloud in her best impression of a snooty nobleman. "By issue of Baron Dado Fin Sect, under the divine authority of High King Nicholas I of the clan Fair Ben." "That's not true," Melina interrupted. Nicholas I is probably not even a descendant of any of the three clans. His great-great-great-grandfather king, I think it was Griffith. Anyway, he started that nonsense about the royal bloodline. He claimed he was a descendant of one of those chieftains, and they ran with it. It's pretty young as traditions go, but— Hush, Ingracia said. Let me finish, love. She began again. With the powers invested within him by divine blah blah blah, we're all very important, yes, yes, yes. The pirate skimmed over the rest of the formalities until she saw her name. We do invest authorities in lady. She emphasized the title, Ingracia Omal of the brigantine Saint Carella and her crew of 80 men. 31 men? Melina cooed, delighting in interrupting again. 49 women? 50, counting you. She scoffed mockingly. I'm not just some woman. Be sure to stipulate that next time. Ingracia laughed and put the letter aside, planting her lips on Melina's. You certainly aren't, but it's a public document, not a poem. You get the point. We've got some protection now. We can actually dock in Aoste and Stateria without avoiding the ports. Melina rolled her eyes. Please, they love you in Stateria. All those cheap foreign goods you give them in Portia. The local lord rolled out the welcome mat for you the last time we arrived. Yes, fair, but now it's a little less worrisome, isn't it? No paranoia about plots or double crosses. We can actually stay ashore for more than a few days at a time. Plus, we'll be able to sell stolen goods at market rates instead of going through fences when we're near the Imperial City. I know. I don't suppose the Shalene will be as welcoming, though. No. He didn't make an exception for the Kingdom of the Sun. If we catch any of them trading there, it's open season. That's never been a problem in the past, has it? No, but I suppose I still think about visiting home, and it would be nice to return without concerns of bounties. Still, I doubt we'll have a chance any time soon. One day we will, I'm sure of it. Melina rested her elbow on the bed and propped her head in her hand so she could look at Ingracia. Her hair was full, thick, wavy like gentle plumes of smoke puffing from a chimney. The pirate caught herself admiring it at times. It was much more full of life than hers was before she cut most of it off. A safety precaution. Short hair was harder to grab and less likely to snag onto something in the heat of battle. She'd considered instructing Melina to do the same, but couldn't bring herself to ask. Melina took great pride in her hair, and Ingracia took equal pleasure in viewing it. I'll show you around Payish, Melina smiled, tossing a lock with the tilt of her head. Take you to the palace to see the Sultan's gardens. Then we'll go to the market where you can buy us some fresh figs, dates, all the foods we never get to enjoy when we dock in the West. Before we daydream about retirement, Ingracia got up and sat at the edge of the bed. We need to discuss something. Dado is tight-lipped about it, but I don't suppose we're just being bought out by the king. Of course not. The girl rose to sit beside her. Don't you know? It's the Statarians doing mostly. They're no doubt planning their second invasion, and they want Aoste's help. They're prodding the Kyakirans' defenses. He emphasized the southeast. Gartro land. It's not the easiest location because it means sailing around the whole country, but it also means avoiding the Hopuri. They gave Stateria a proper hiding the last time they tried to invade. I'm aware of the Hopuri, but not the hiding. You ought to read some of the books I give you. Melina stretched her arms and got out of bed. She pulled on an oversized blouse and sat by the vanity mirror beside the window to the port. Pushing the hair from her face, she fumbled around Ingracia's dresser for a brush. He didn't tell you because he probably assumed you knew, she said. It was a defeat heard around the world, a humiliation. I don't know that a single ship made it to shore. They say no one sails like a Hopuri, but Statarians have their heads so far up their own asses they can't imagine someone beating them at anything. Hopuri are whalers mostly. I hear they use whale for everything, even make houses out of the bones. Most of their children can probably throw a harpoon better than a trained Statarian soldier before they hit 9 or 10. No pirating south of Farron's Rock, as the saying goes. Nothing to haul and everything to lose if a Hopuri ship catches you in those waters. Every now and then, some idiot tries and is never heard of again. Thankfully, Dado didn't seem much interested in sending us that way. What about those other folks you mentioned? The Gato? Gartro, Melina corrected her. Honestly, I don't know a thing. I've only heard the name, but no one seems to know much about them. They must trade with someone, probably Sapertia and Istia. I'm sure they'll have some novelties that folks will pay well for. Maybe the Anastasi trade with them, too. If we can get our hands on something from them, some of those Statarians in the Magocracy will pay enough that we'll never have to work again. Enough for dates and figs? Ingracia smiled coyly. And then some. Though I suppose if it were that easy, everyone would do it, wouldn't they? A lack of ambition. Most pirates stick to what's always been done. You can go off of the wisdom of plunderers past, or experience working the sails for some merchant ship for a few months. Most folks wash out from the latter and head to shore to drink away the little they've got to show for their bruises and scars. Others go in search of a crew to rob their former employers blind. But that short-sightedness makes for a shit legacy and, more importantly, nothing resembling a decent retirement. I have no intention of ending up like that. Neither do I. Melina grinned softly, her brown eyes peering at the pirate. She walked from the mirror and knelt in front of Ingracia, resting her head on her lap. Running her fingers through Melina's soft, full hair, Ingracia smiled faintly. Only figs and dates for us, my love. Chapter 4. Ingracia awoke with Melina's limbs tossed over her body and a dehydrated headache that made her skull throb. She carefully maneuvered from under the girl so as not to wake her and stumbled towards the cabin window. A personal water trap hung over the port side of the ship. A sheep pelt hung out to catch vapor through the night. She wrung the water into a bowl and sipped, using the rest to wash her face before looking into the mirror. Bags hung under her eyes, and her skin was developing a red hue from constant exposure to the sun. Despite her attempts to remain quiet, Melina stirred awake behind her. Nothing from the spotters? She half yawned. She already knew the answer, but asking had become a formality. I doubt they're even looking anymore, Ingracia grumbled in reply. Melina didn't speak. She planted the seeds of doubt after the first month they spent east of Kyakiro. It wasn't worth it to challenge her now, knowing it would only encourage the captain to dig her heels in further. Nothing. Months at sea yielded nothing. The treasury on board was empty, owed entirely to back wages and supply costs. Not one Gartro ship, no one from Sapertia, Istia, anywhere. Melina and Ingracia argued incessantly about whether they'd been conned, manipulated by Dado to get them out of his territory. They went about their business as usual, scrubbing the hull, overseeing ship maintenance, and running drills with the crew. The rest of the ship's time was spent draining the rapidly dwindling supply of grog and playing Shaleen Tarney, a card game taught to them by Melina when she was first captured. Gambling was prohibited, but the captain turned a blind eye during times of low morale. Unfortunately, the novelty of that was wearing off quickly, and worse, was only reminding the workers of the money they were missing out on as they wagered smaller and smaller pools. Tension was growing on deck. Months without plundering had the crew ready to let out their energy in whatever way they could, and it was getting difficult to prevent infighting. Ingracia had to act before thoughts of mutiny could enter their imaginations. When a fight broke out between two crewmates, she decided it was time to make a decision. She met with Melina that night in her quarters while a thunderstorm forced everyone else to retreat below deck. Ingracia squeezed rain from her now uncomfortably, for her at least, long hair, what she'd give to go ashore and visit a barber again. Vidal is being treated by our surgeon and Gallus is in the brig, she said. We'll have to maroon them both at the next opportunity, or we'll have several months of tensions explode on us. Melina was seated quietly by the window and staring at the breaks of lightning flashing over the sea in the distance. I know we've been months without a haul, Ingracia complained. But for fuck's sake, is it too much to ask they not act like children? Fucking Dado. The next Aostian ship I see, I'll throw their captain to the sharks, brand their crew, sink their fucking ship, and make them row back to their fucking homeland to see what happens when I'm crossed. I don't understand, Melina muttered, eyes still gazing out the window. There ought to have been a sense of pride in finally winning her captain over, but she didn't feel any. Instead, she was perplexed by Dado's decision. At first, she'd thought it as simple as a ruse to rid his seas of their likes, but that didn't make sense. Surely there were worse and more prevalent threats than just them. More infamous pirates, rogue mercenaries, disease-ridden ships trying to dock. What's there to understand? You called it our second week here. We were tricked. He knew there would be nothing out here. Ingracia was catching up too slowly for her second-in-command's liking. Melina snapped her head around and scowled. But he must have also known we'd come back when we realized the con. Why go through the trouble just to piss us off? Ingracia was kicking off her boots and tossing them aside a little more forcefully than intended. Or maybe he just wanted to clean up some of the trash before some fucking dignitary rolled into town. Some petty political bullshit, no doubt. Fucking Aostian nobility are nothing but a collection of the most opportunistic scum to walk this fucking planet. She was enraged, and with Aoste nearly a month away, there was nothing she could do but marinate in her anger. We can't sail right back. We've crossed the Caser and the Tortosan. We don't have enough supplies or money to feed and pay the crew. She paced the captain's quarters and tried to count the number of days to Aoste in her head. Melina got into bed without a word and rolled over. She closed her eyes and thought, to her frustration, once more of Baron Checht. Maybe if she'd been able to speak with him alongside her, she could have gotten more out of him. But Ingracia insisted she go alone, lest she appear incapable of handling her own affairs as captain. Ingracia sighed as she undressed, knowing she would be staring at the ceiling and listening to the storm for a long while before her body would let her rest. It would be difficult to get any sleep before the sun was up, and it was time to relieve the night helmsman. Part of her still didn't want to let go of her ambitions of privateering, but Melina was right the first time. They were conned. The letter of marque was a lie, and Dado was back in Dublin laughing at them. "I should have known," she muttered beneath her breath. "Perhaps," Melina answered from beside her in a gentle whisper, "but I understand why you didn't. It is easier to cling to a shark's belly than to continue swimming in the school while its jaws draw nearer. Times have changed, my love. We both knew this was coming. The Caser is not the treasure trove it once was. Every ship has as many mercenaries as crewmen these days. You're hard-pressed to find a galleon without 4 armed escorts in tow. We never had to pick our fights like we do now, only set sail for whichever ship we saw first. Aosta may seem unorganized, and it is indeed slow to stir, but if it has ever been able to rally to anything, it's to the defense of its merchants." "Times are changing," Ingracia repeated with a tired nod, her eyelids drooping. The calmness of Melina's voice brought a relief to her, mostly because it meant the tension between them over this disastrous venture was dissipating. Melina always felt warmer once she'd gotten her way, which she often did. But Ingracia didn't mind that now. Instead of laying awake, cursing each wave that rocked them, she felt calm. She rolled over, welcomed by the comforting embrace of a soft, sympathetic stare. "Must things change so soon? There was more I wished to do." "There is still time. We will just have to adapt some other way. Maybe we won't find out tonight, but we will eventually." Ingracia brushed the tips of her fingers over Melina's cheek. She was warm to the touch. Her hands found the thick locks of her hair and stroked long, unbroken brushes through the silk tendrils that flowed down her back. "I never wanted to work for the barons or the king or anyone else. Must change mean capitulation? Always working in the employ of others and obeying the mandates of the man with the biggest army? Will the armies grow so great that no place, land or sea, is free from the jurisdiction of someone more powerful? Have the times so changed that it is impossible to live without a master?" "It must be possible," Melina replied. "Masters do it. Then is that all there is? To be a master or a servant?" Melina didn't give an answer. She knew Ingracia did not want one. She would know if she was lying, and she would find nothing of use in the truth. Instead, she did the only thing she could, return Ingracia's touch. She cupped the pirate's face in her hand and kissed her gently. First on her forehead, then the tip of her nose, and finally pressing the soft brush of her lips against hers. Pulling her tightly to her body and taking her in an embrace, they would escape, if only for a brief moment, the futility that raged around them, a man-made force more powerful than any storm or restless sea. They would find refuge in each other, an oasis in the depths of hell. In the afterglow of their stint of abandon, the tide of reality came in, but with it returned a clarity almost forgotten. They lay side by side, tired and satisfied. Ingracia leant on her elbow to look at Melina, smiling at the mess of hair obstructing most of her face. "Notes of credit Wealth stored in hideaways south of Aosta, more than enough to pay our sailors to retire if we can only return home. We can keep our contacts, reconnect when we've plotted a more thorough plan. Who's to say that if Aosta doesn't adapt, we can't too? There is still money in smuggling sand nectar, Nordic meads, Statirian spirits. We can undercut local sellers by going around the tariffs. We know enough fences and enough safe routes to smuggle with little trouble. It won't be enough to retire on, but it will cover the costs of bigger crews, a galleon of enough sailors to challenge any cocky merchant who thinks he can pay his way out to safety. Enough that we can continue to be the nightmares of every shipping mogul east of the Caser. One thing at a time, dear. Melina rolled away from Ingracia, turning over and facing away, but reaching one hand back for her to take. Triumphant in her persuasion and carnally fulfilled, she was prepared to fall into a peaceful sleep. Their fingers entwined, and Melina gave Ingracia's hand a gentle squeeze. We'll begin anew tomorrow. For now, our ship's coffers are bare and we're down to just hardtack. You're right. Ingracia sighed, releasing Melina's hand and rolling onto her back so she could rest her own beneath her head. We'll have to remedy that. She strained to rise, still undressed, now more than ever aware of the breeze coming in from their open window, and strolled over to the cabinet where she kept her personal store of mostly stolen liquors, beers, meads, and other captured intoxicants. Most of the domestic goods were distributed among the crew, but Ingracia tended to keep more exotic, rare finds for herself. There was even a small pouch of sand nectar tucked away next to a silver chalene pipe, both taken from a spice merchant who was hiding the drug beneath shipments of coriander and nutmeg bound for southern Stateria. She grabbed an already opened bottle of marble brandy, so named for its distilleries in the imperial city, endearingly referred to as the Marble Lady by most of Stateria's inhabitants, and hurried back to the comfort and warmth of the covers. Marble brandy was a rare sight outside of its namesake, due in large part to the exorbitant taxes levied on its export. To find a sealed bottle as she did was a rare accomplishment, and she'd saved the liquor for times of celebration. Cheap Aostian whiskies were better for troubled drinking. They tasted like a chamber pot, and 2 pennies worth would render a person so drunk they couldn't think about their problems and too hungover when they'd sobered up to care about them. Sitting up, she uncorked the bottle and took a swig, feeling a numbing, comfortable sting in her throat and a flood of heat filling her belly. Without turning around, Melina gestured with her hand. There's north, a few days to Stateria's shores, Ingracia suggested and handed the brandy off. That's a start. She heard a gulp from beside her and felt Melina shift to hand it back. Enough to fill the coffers for the route home, maybe some food. If not, we can use what we haul to purchase something around Portia like usual. We're sure to find something that will hold us over. Melina muttered, not wishing to keep the deep, restful sleep awaiting her away for any longer. Ingracia continued anyway. From there, perhaps we'll take an Aostian ship, preferably something from Horizon or of the Crown. A humble fraction of vengeance to hold me over. Only until I can work out a way to place Dado's head on a pike and display it over the helm. Your pillow talk is as romantic as ever, my love, Melina yawned. Seconds later, her side of the bed was rising and falling steadily. Ingracia remained upright a while longer, mentally plotting their change in course. Times were changing, and times rarely changed for the better. And yet, here she was. Times would change, but so would she, as she had always done, because there was a lesson she'd learned from adversity and anguish in a ceaseless maelstrom of obstacles. Ingracia learned that she could and would persevere. Unfortunately, these things are easier to speak of in the abstract. In the muck of tribulation, one rarely emerges unscathed, and even more unfortunate, the world has a habit of upping the ante until such a lesson is forgotten.